Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something important in vascular disease treatment, critical limb ischemia, or CLI, and specifically, we're zeroing in on those arteries below the knee, the infrapopliteal ones.
That's right. These are, smaller vessels, and when they get seriously blocked, it's a huge problem for patients. Think non-healing sores, lots of pain, and, well, a really worrying risk of amputation.
Which brings us right to the core question for this deep dive. We've been examining a key study. It asks, are drug-eluting balloons, DABs, actually better, more effective and safer than just standard balloon angioplasty POB for opening these arteries up?
Exactly. That's the mission, basically, to see if these DEBs really improve blood flow down there.
So if you're interested in the kind of cutting edge of vascular treatments, especially for these tough below-the-knee cases,
Or even just curious about how clinical trials work and why sometimes, promising tech doesn't quite pan out as hoped.
then this deep dive is definitely for you.
Yeah, we're going to unpack a pretty significant trial and what it tells us about putting new treatments into practice.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Why is treating these specific arteries, the ones below the knee, so critical in CLI patients? Lay out the problem for us.
Right. Well, CLI, as we said, it's the really severe end of peripheral artery disease. Patients often have multiple blockages in these smaller infrapopliteal arteries. Blood flow to the feet, the toes, it's just drastically cut down.
And that leads to the pain, the wounds.
Precisely. Persistent pain, wounds that just refuse to heal, and yeah, that have very high risk of amputation. The traditional method, POBA, is basically inflating a small balloon inside the artery.
To squash the plaque flat and widen the channel.
Exactly. Compress the plaque, open the vessel, get more blood flowing.
But I take it POBA isn't always the perfect fix in these particular arteries. There must be downsides.
You got it. A major, major issue with POD on there is restenosis.
The artery narrowing again.
Yeah, it happens a lot. It's partly the body's sort of healing response gone wrong, cells grow back, tissue builds up, and clogs the artery again. Plus, these patients often have atherosclerosis just, well, everywhere. So new blockages can pop up too.
Okay, so that explains the search for something better, which leads us to these drug-eluting balloons, the DEBs. What's the basic idea behind them? How are they supposed to work?
The core concept is pretty smart, actually. You take the standard balloon angioplasty, but you add a drug coating to the balloon. So when you inflate it, you're not just opening the vessel, you're also delivering medication right onto the artery wall.
And the drug in this case was paclitaxel. I've heard of that.
Yes, paclitaxel. It's used in other things like cancer treatment sometimes. Here, its job is to be anti-proliferative.
Meaning it stops cells from multiplying?
Exactly. It inhibits those cells that cause the restenosis, that re-narrowing. So the balloon gets coated, you inflate it at the blockage site, the drug transfers to the tissue, and hopefully
it stops or slows down that re-narrowing process we see with POBA alone.
that's the goal. Yeah.
Makes sense. Deliver the treatment right where it's needed. So to figure out if this actually works in these tricky below-the-knee arteries, they ran a big trial. Let's get into the IMPACT-DEB trial. What was its main objective?
Okay, so the IMPACT-DEB trial was set up specifically to compare this particular drug-eluting balloon, the IMPACT-Amphion, or IA-DEB, against standard angioplasty PTA. They wanted to know, definitively, is this DEB safer and more effective for treating these infrapopliteal blockages in CLI patients? Does it improve outcomes?
And how did they design the study to get that answer? What was the setup?
It was a pretty robust design, perspective, so they followed patients forward over time.
Right.
Multi-center, 13 sites across Europe, which is good for generalizability.
Makes the results less likely to be just a fluke of one hospital.
Exactly. And importantly, it was patient-blinded. The patients didn't know which balloon they got.
Okay.
And it was a randomized controlled trial, the gold standard, really. Patients were randomly assigned to receiving the IA-DEB for every one patient who got standard PTA.
2-to-1 randomization. So more got the DEB. How many patients were involved overall?
They enrolled 358 patients, all with CLI. And here's a key point. A very high percentage of them, over 80% in the DEB group, about 77% in the PTA group, had really severe disease, Rutherford Category 5. That means major tissue loss, ulcers, gangrene. These are folks at very high risk.
Wow. Okay, so a seriously ill group. What were the main things the researchers measured? The key endpoints for efficacy and safety?
For efficacy, the main things were, 1, clinically driven target lesion revascularization, CDTLR.
Which means?
Basically needing another procedure on that same spot because symptoms got worse or the wound wasn't healing.
Okay. And the other efficacy measure?
Late lumen loss, or LLL. That's a measurement from an angiogram and X-ray of the artery showing how much the inside of the artery narrowed again over 12 months.
Got it. And on the safety side?
The primary safety endpoint was a combination of bad outcomes within the first 6 months. It included death from any cause, major amputation of the treated leg, and that CDTLR again.
Okay, a composite endpoint. And they followed them for longer too, right?
Oh yeah, the plan was for 5 years of follow-up for everyone. And for a subset, about 167 patients, they planned a repeat angiogram at 12 months, specifically to measure that late lumen loss.
Who was in that subset?
These were patients whose blockages were 10 centimeters long or less, and who agreed up front to have that 12-month angiogram. It gave a closer look at how the vessel itself was doing.
Right. Now, before we jump into the results, you mentioned there were some differences between the two groups right at the start, the baseline characteristics.
Yeah, mostly similar, but a few things were statistically different. Interestingly, the DEB group, the ones getting the new balloon, actually had shorter lesions on average.
Okay.
But they also had more patients with impaired inflow problems with blood supply coming from higher up the leg, and more had previous procedures on that leg. Their wounds were also, on average, a bit less deep than the PTA group. The p-values showed these weren't likely just random chance differences.
So maybe slightly less severe local blockage length and wound depth in the DEB group, but perhaps more complex overall vascular issues or history.
Potentially, yeah. It's a bit of a mixed picture at baseline.
Okay, the crucial moment. What did the IMPACT-DEB trial actually find? Did the DEB prove to be better?
This is where things took a, well, unexpected turn. The trial failed to show that the IA-DEB was superior to standard PTA.
Failed. Wow.
And more than that, the results actually raised some pretty serious safety questions about using this specific DEB in this location.
Okay, let's break that down. What about the need for repeat procedures, the CDTLR?
At the 12-month mark, looking just at the patients who were alive and hadn't had a major amputation, the rate of needing another procedure was 9.2% for the DEB group and 13.1% for the standard PTA group.
So lower for the DEB, numerically at least.
Numerically lower, yes, but the difference wasn't statistically significant. The p-value was 0.291, so you can't really say the DEB was better based on that.
No clear win there. What about the angiograms? Did the arteries look better, stay open wider with the DEB?
No. The 12-month angiographic follow-up didn't show any significant benefit either. That late lumen loss measure, almost identical. 0.61 millimeters for DEB, 0.62 for PTA. P-value basically 1.0, no difference.
Wow.
And same story for binary restenosis, like a strict definition of re-narrowing, and for complete reocclusion where the artery just blocks off again. No significant differences there either. P-values were high, 0.6, 0.5 roughly.
So based on the pictures, the drug wasn't really stopping the artery from narrowing again compared to just the plain balloon? That is surprising.
It really was, given the theory.
Okay, now the safety outcomes. You said there were concerns.
Yes, this is the really worrying part. The main safety endpoint, the composite at 6 months, it actually met the criteria for non-inferiority.
Meaning it wasn't proven to be statistically worse than PTA on that combined measure early on?
Right. But when they looked specifically at major amputations at 12 months, the rate was numerically higher in the IA-DEB group.
Higher. How much higher?
It was 8.8% in the DEB group versus 3.6% in the PTA group. The p-value was 0.080.
P-value 0.08. So very close to being statistically significant and definitely a concerning trend.
Absolutely raises a red flag. It suggests a potential harm.
Were there other safety signals pointing in that direction?
Yeah, another combined endpoint looking at all-cause death plus any amputation, major or minor, that was also higher in the DEB group, 35.2% versus 25.2% for PTA, with a p-value of 0.064. Again, close to significant and pointing the wrong way.
Goodness. So let's pull this together. The IMPACT-DEB trial finds no clear benefit for the DEB on repeat procedures or keeping the artery open.
Right.
And a worrying signal towards more major amputations at 1 year with the DEB.
That's the gist of it, yes.
So what did the investigators conclude overall?
Their conclusion was pretty stark. Despite the DEB group starting with arguably slightly less severe local disease, in some ways shorter lesions, shallower wounds, the PTA group ended up with similar angiographic results and, crucially, a lower rate of major amputation.
And this wasn't just academic, right? These findings had real-world consequences.
Absolutely, big consequences. Because of these safety concerns, the IMPACT-DEB trial was actually stopped early.
Wow.
And that specific device, the IMPACT-DEB, was withdrawn from the market.
That really drives home the importance of these large trials, doesn't it? You need the numbers and the rigorous comparison to catch these things.
You really do. It shows that you can't just assume something works everywhere based on theory or smaller studies.
No, like any study, IMPACT-DEB had limitations the authors pointed out. What were some of those?
Well, first, they acknowledged the study wasn't really powered, statistically speaking, to give a definitive answer on major amputation rates alone. So that 0.08 p-value needs that context.
Okay.
Second, the doctors doing the procedure knew which balloon they were using. They weren't blinded. That could potentially introduce some bias, maybe subconsciously.
Right. Maybe they treat patients slightly differently knowing it's the new thing versus the standard.
Possibly. They also mentioned a lack of totally standardized rules across all 13 centers for deciding on amputation, or exactly how wound care was managed post-procedure.
Ah, so some variability between sites could muddy the waters a bit.
Could introduce some noise, yeah. And finally, they didn't get quite as many patients back for the 12-month angiograms or wound photos as they'd hoped. Lower compliance means the data might be incomplete.
Important caveats to keep in mind. Now, you mentioned smaller, earlier studies. The authors referenced some that had actually looked promising for this same DEB.
That's right. There was definitely prior optimism. Before IMPACT-DEB, some single-center studies had suggested this IA-DEB did reduce restenosis and reinterventions below the knee, like a 2011 study by Schmidt et al. It showed lower restenosis at 3 months, especially in longer lesions.
Okay.
And then in 2013, Lister et al. Published a randomized trial, specifically in diabetic patients. They found significant benefits for the IA-DEB over PTA. At 12 months, less restenosis, fewer occlusions, fewer repeat procedures.
So those earlier results painted a much rosier picture.
They really did. It highlights just how crucial these large, multi-center randomized trials are. Sometimes the signal gets lost in the noise in smaller studies, or maybe the patient groups are slightly different, but the big trial gives you the clearer, sometimes harder truth.
What about research since IMPACT-DEB? Have other DBs been studied below the knee?
Yes, the field hasn't stood still. There was the BioLUX-P2 trial using a different paclitaxel balloon. It also didn't show a significant win on its primary endpoint or amputation rates compared to PTA, but importantly, its safety profile looked cleaner, let's say, than what IMPACT-DEB found. Less concerning signals.
Okay.
And there's ongoing work with the Lutonix-DB. Some early 6-month data, like from the Mustafa et al. Trial, looked promising, maybe particularly in the upper parts of the below-knee arteries. But we're still waiting for the longer-term results on that one.
So it sounds like the jury might still be out on DDs below the knee in general, but the IMPACT-DEB trial was a major setback for that specific device and maybe tempered enthusiasm overall.
I think that's fair to say. IMPACT-DEB was a really important data point. It showed that what works well higher up the leg in the femoral popliteal arteries, where DEBs have shown more consistent benefit, doesn't just automatically work below the knee.
Why might that be? The different environment.
Very likely. These infrapopliteal arteries are smaller, the flow dynamics are different, maybe the biology of the vessel wall responds differently. It's just a tougher neighborhood, vascularly speaking. So while endovascular therapy, like angioplasty, is still often the go-to, especially for patients who aren't great candidates for bypass surgery,
Right.
the role of drug elution in this specific area is clearly more complex and needs really careful ongoing study.
Okay, so wrapping this up, our deep dive into IMPACT-DEB really presents a kind of cautionary story, doesn't it, about this one specific DEB below the knee. The initial promise, the hopes based on mechanism and maybe earlier studies, they just didn't hold up in the big trial. And worse, it raised safety flags.
Exactly. Flags serious enough to lead to its withdrawal. It hammers home the point about rigorous testing. You absolutely need these large-scale trials before widely adopting new tech.
You really do. Assumptions based on other vessel beds just aren't enough.
Not in medicine, no. Especially not in complex areas like this.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given these findings, what does this tell us about the sheer challenge of taking therapies that work in bigger, simpler pipes, let's say, and applying them to the tiny, intricate network below the knee? And maybe even more fundamentally, how critical is getting that long-term data, really following patients out for years when we're trying to judge if a new device is truly safe and effective, especially for these very vulnerable CLI patients?
It just shows, doesn't it, that the road to better treatments isn't always straight. It involves careful steps, sometimes unexpected results, and a constant need to keep asking questions and gathering evidence.
A really important lesson. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.